Thank you for coming here. We have two experts who observe the ruble crisis carefully. Vasily Astrov, who covers Ukraine but also Russia to some extent in developments currently, and Vladimir Gligorov, who is one of our microeconomists who has been studying exchange rate developments and exchange rate crisis also in other historical contexts. So let me start to ask you, Vasily, about the rather dramatic developments which took place, basically not only in this week, but also prior to that, in terms of a dramatic ruble devaluation. How has the process developed? What are the special features of this ruble crisis?
Well, there were several reasons. So if you look at the dynamics of the Russian ruble over the past year, then you will see that the Russian ruble lost about half of its value against the US dollar. But this process started already in spring. So it was not only the fall of the oil prices which had an impact on the ruble, because oil prices started declining only the second half of this year, but there were also other factors. So at the beginning of the year, to some extent, it was driven by the monetary tightening in the United States, so the tapering of the quantitative easing program. And in that sense, the Russian ruble was not the only one which was affected. There were other currencies of the so-called emerging markets like Indonesia, India, Turkey, if I remember correctly. And some of them were actually affected even more. But that was one factor. The next factor, which was more important, was, of course, the Ukraine crisis and the related sanctions. So as a result of the Ukrainian crisis, as a result of the accession of the Crimea to Russia, the West imposed sanctions. And there were different types of sanctions, but the most important ones were financial sanctions. Because of these financial sanctions, which have been imposed on some key banks and companies in the oil sector, these enterprises cannot refinance their external debt anymore, and so basically there is a situation of net capital outflows, and this has put the Russian ruble under additional pressure. So all these factors have played a role, but the most important one, and which became particularly visible in the second half of the year and over the past few months, was the fall in the decline in the oil prices. Basically by about nearly by half since June this year.
Thank you very much. Vladimir, in the context of historical comparisons, it's not unusual to see falls of currencies in a currency crisis by 50-60%. We have seen that in Latin America, we have seen that in the Asian crisis. What seems to be rather special in the Russian situation, that we're looking at the country which is de facto a net creditor country for many years, has had current account surpluses, and also where we don't have the feature which was very common in all the previous crises, namely that the private sector would have a high load of foreign debt. So why is Russia, what is special about the Russian situation? Why was it similarly vulnerable to these previous cases?
Well, it depends on how you look at this in terms of, shall we say, models of crisis. One would be that this is a typical currency crisis, precipitated primarily by the fall in the oil prices, to which then the exchange
and therefore
rate,
future export earnings.
Exactly, and then the exchange rate is trying to find a new equilibrium given the expectations of future oil prices, which are the main source of revenue and also main source of foreign revenue and foreign currency. So that would be one. Then you have really a typical currency crisis, which is precipitated by the external shock, and to which the exchange rate has to adjust. It has a tendency to overshoot simply because it will reward those that will be going out of the currency ex ante and then coming back ex post, like a speculative sort of profit will be made, and that would be the end of the story. Of course, that will have financial consequences, and that would be then a test for the central bank and the Ministry of Finance to deal with that. In the Russian case, it shouldn't be very difficult, given the the fact that they have a very large reserves. The question is whether they want to spend it or not, and how. That would be one possibility. The other possibility is that this is a sudden stop type of a crisis, and some aspects are taken to actually that explanation, because all of a sudden companies, banks that have a foreign exposure cannot refinance and have to pay back, which means that they need to buy foreign currency on the market, and that drives the exchange rate down. That is essentially an attack, or if you wish, that is a claim on the reserves. And then the question will be, in that type of a crisis, what would be the monetary response and what would be the fiscal response? Again, that is a problem for Russia for the very fact that much of these reserves and much of this foreign currency that Russia is a net creditor with are actually in public hands, because they are, in a way, a reserve that needs to smooth exactly these kinds of shocks to oil and gas prices. So it is tricky for them to lose too much or to spend too much of these reserves to sort of save their companies and save their banks. And that's essentially the main problem that they are dealing with at the moment.
Okay, so we are going to come now to the question of the possible scenarios for the Russian economy. It's interesting that Russia has certain advantages compared to other instances like the Asian economy. For example, it has a big war chest of big reserves. It also, as you pointed out, has a more centralized command over the debt situation, because it's the government who controls that. While there was in Asia, there were companies which were highly indebted, and on the other hand, of course, we have a rather weak economy in structural terms, yeah? Which was not obviously the case for Korea or in the Asian economy, which had a diversified economy, a very strong export performance in the long run. We also saw something similar in Europe, the differentiation between Ireland and the southern European economies. So let me ask you, Vasily, how do you see the scenario as it will evolve in Russia over the next year, let's say, and also longer-term perspectives in relation to both the more short-term macroeconomic management tasks, but also the structural tasks in relation to the Russian economy?
Well, since the main reason for this depreciation have been the falling oil prices, I think that there is little hope for a rebound of the exchange rate as long as the oil prices stay at their current level, or if they fall even further, which may also happen. So this, as you rightly pointed out, this is a reflection of the structural weakness. This is the reflection of the fact that the Russian economy is very heavily dependent on the oil and gas exports. And this is basically a reflection of the government failure to diversify and modernize the economy over the past years. So the challenge here would be, of course, a structural challenge. It's not so much a macroeconomic challenge, it's a structural challenge. What would you do to diversify the economy, to make it less dependent on the volatile oil prices? And here basically one would see two ways. One way would be to attract more foreign direct investment, which would bring new technologies, which would be able to restructure the other sectors of the Russian economy, which are not very competitive. Most of them are not very competitive at the moment, and some of them actually don't really exist. But this would be difficult, I think, under the current in the current environment, because of the numerous institutional deficiencies which are well known, because of the corruption, because of the insecurity of property rights, because of the fact that, for instance, courts are not really independent and so on. I think this is a big concern. And also the political developments are not conducive to it. This political standoff between Russia and the West is also a problem, of course, also for the influence of Western capital. And another way so to say, to diversify the Russian economy would be maybe to implement more industrial policy tools. In principle, the government would have the money to do that. The problem is that it is not easy to set the right priority, and it is also a problem that the effectiveness of state expenditures, which basically would be needed in order to implement those industrial policy tools, is very much constrained by the high corruption. So a lot of the money which would be allocated for that would end up, so to say, in the wrong pockets. And I think this is a serious challenge for Russia at the moment.
So Vladimir, let me still come back to the management of the crisis in the more shorter run here. So as you said, one big decision is what to do with the big reserves, how to use them. The other concern, of course, political concern, but also policy concern, is the very likely increase of the inflation rate, which is going to have real income effects, etc. And probably the third concern is the potential reaction by holders of foreign currency to continue to have capital flight out of the country. So which instruments are now at the disposal, and how do you think they will be used or should be used?
Well, in the short run, obviously stability will be the main concern, because you don't really want to have a domino effect in the financial sector. And so the question will be, and this I think is what, as far as I can tell, the central bank and the Ministry of Finance are doing, is how to bridge these problems that people or companies and banks that have to refinance and cannot in the foreign markets, how they can pay back their debts, or what kind of conditions are the central bank going to impose on them to do that, and so on. So some of the spending of the reserves will be absolutely necessary. That cannot be avoided. But the question is whether this will be just for the stability, which I think is the current stance of the central bank, just to provide liquidity and stability to the financial sector. The other thing is what will be the position of the Ministry of Finance and the government generally. It seems to be the case that they will be trying to cut spending, even though the budget will be in surplus, but there will be all these additional now obligations to service. So there will be some other things that will suffer, but the idea would be that would at least stabilize the situation. So that I would think would be, it seems to be the direction that they are taking, with essentially letting ruble more or less not completely freely, but float and find its equilibrium in the new situation. Whether that's good or bad, it really is very hard to say, because at the moment there is a pressure from two sides to do differently. One is this protectionist pressure, to put it that way, which is to essentially introduce capital controls, and in that sense stem or sap the further erosion, which I think would be rather counterproductive at the moment.
Why is that? The discussion in the Malaysian case was that it was a rather useful instrument to use in comparative terms at that time.
The reason is that in many other cases you are actually dealing with foreign capital that is about to flee, and if you unexpectedly stop that, this is like stopping the run on the banks, to use that comparison, and that should work. However, if you already have a huge amount of foreign money domestically owned already outside, that of course will not bring that money back, and that creates then a rather different situation. It may stop additional hemorrhage, so to speak, but it will not bring the money which is outside back, which in the case of Russia, where essentially due to current account surpluses over a period of years, that's essentially why this money is outside anyway. So that would be counterproductive. That would be one. So that's one push that also goes with the idea that you could switch completely to ruble, meaning you would essentially, first of all, mandate all this money to come back, then try to put it in ruble, and then have a capital control so that it won't get out. That would be one idea. I think that there is some elements of that we will see in what is going to happen, and that will be, in my opinion, rather counterproductive. The other approach would be, I think, but that's unrealistic, to try to even engage the IMF in this whole business, because after all, if you can't refinance in the commercial banks or from some other sovereign lenders, the IMF should be the lender of last resort. That, I think, will not happen. So we will essentially have possibly a combination of protectionist measures of various kinds on one hand, and probably some selective measures of saving, spending your own money to save some selected groups of companies, banks, and so on. That would be, I think, the way things will go in the short run.
Vasily, we have been thinking in Institute quite a lot about the repercussions of the Russian and also the Ukraine crisis on the rest of the European economy. And I know you have done some quantitative work also on assessing, at least via the trade route, the impact on different European economies, and Austria in particular. Probably can tell us a little bit about the impact you expect to have.
Well, what we have seen already is that the imports to Russia and also European imports to Russia have been declining. And that was basically, well, there were many reasons, but the two main reasons were the depreciation of the Russian ruble, which has already taken place by about 10-15% this year, or let's say in the first 9 months of this year. And second, the embargo which has been imposed by Russia as a counter-sanction to the Western sanctions. So basically Russia does not import any food products anymore. There are some exceptions, but basically this is an embargo on the food imports from the European Union, and also the United States and some other countries. But of course, what we have seen so far, this has been only a relatively minor depreciation. Now we are in a situation where the depreciation is much stronger. So I already said that the ruble has lost about half of its value since the beginning of the year, and I don't think the prospects for a rebound are very bright. So basically, we will be in a situation of a much weaker ruble over the next year, maybe probably 2 years, well, in the short and medium term, and this will of course have a major impact on the import demand. And I would say in the first place on the demand for imported luxury goods, or goods which are, let's say, which are not essential goods, for instance, imported cars. Yes, and that would of course mean that the countries which are relatively dependent on exports to Russia, for instance, whose car exports are relatively dependent on the Russian market, will be affected. For instance, Germany, Czech Republic, Slovakia. Generally, the countries which are relatively dependent on the Russian market, such as, for instance, the Baltic countries, Finland, also some other countries in Eastern Europe, they will be affected more, simply because basically the collapse of the Russian market will affect them more. Otherwise, other countries which are less dependent, well, France, Spain, United Kingdom, they will be affected less.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to follow this crisis also in the coming weeks, and we might continue that debate. Thank you very much.